Very few people make their acting debut at the age of 71. John Houseman is one who did, playing the role of the stern law professor in The Paper Chase. But acting in films merely put a topping on his 45-year career in the theater as a writer, director, and producer. Years during which his name has been associated with countless critical successes, including the short-lived Mercury Theater, which he co-founded with Orson Welles. The story of those early years in the theater is told in his recently published autobiography entitled Run Through. Mr. Houseman, after coming to this country as a businessman and losing all of your money in your business in the 1929 crash, you went into theater. And it wasn't long after you went into theater that you first met Orson Welles playing in Romeo and Juliet. That's right. You tell me that you put him in the starring role in Panic.
As a septuagenarian, yes.
How did he do?
Wonderful. Got very good
What was the qualities about this man as an actor that...
Well, in this particular instance, it was his impressiveness, his mass, and also the fantastic...
His mass? Just the sheer size?
Well, not just cubic content, but I mean the mass, his effect on an audience, and that was largely of that extraordinary face, but also largely the voice, which was simply the most magnificent instrument that I think any of us have ever heard.
And it made an enormous impression upon you, I gather, when you first heard it.
Oh, it did indeed.
After Panic, you went into WPA Theater.
Yes, well then came the Federal Theater and the WPA, and through, again, a series of circumstances relating back to some extent to Four Saints and Three Acts, which had been played entirely by black singers and
rehearsed
dancers.
in Harlem?
Yes. As a result of that, and because of a very dear friend of mine called Rose McClendon, who was the greatest black actress probably that we've had in our history, and who was asked to form the Negro unit of the Federal Theater, but who unfortunately fell sick. But before she did, she asked that I be her associate and that she'd like to work with me. So that's how I came to Harlem. And we had a very exciting and wonderful time.
What made those exciting years?
Well, in the first place, you had a theater, the challenge of it. You had a theater with 750 people, some of whom were quite great names in the black theater, others were totally inexperienced. And the whole Depression era was, no matter what one may think of it, economically or sociologically, it was a very exciting time emotionally. And among other, I made a decision very early that I would break the theater into two parts, one which would do black plays by black authors, directed by black directors on black subjects, and the other that we would simply treat the black actors as first-class actors and do the classics with them. And in order to do the classics, I wanted a young, not set in his ways director, a young man with a great deal of imagination and dynamic power, and the obvious choice was Orson, who had never directed anything in this country, but one had a hunch about him. And I asked him if he would do it. He said yes, and the next day he called up and said, I know what I want to do. I want to do Macbeth, and we'll lay it in Haiti because the Christophe story very closely resembles the Macbeth story. And he did, and it was a sort of historic event and a very great success. Then Orson and I turned the theater over to our black collaborators up there and moved downtown where we had a so-called classical theater, but in fact it wasn't that because we did all kinds of things. So we preferred to call it Project 891, which was the official name.
The bureaucratic name.
The bureaucratic name, but we liked the name. And we did, Orson directed Dr. Faustus, the Marlowe Dr. Faustus, which amazingly enough ran for 5 months in New York City to full houses, which had always before been thought of as a closet drama. Then we moved on from there and did the Cradle Will Rock, the Blitzstein Cradle Will Rock.
Before you get on to the Cradle Will Rock, you make mention of Orson Welles as a magician.
That's right.
In Dr. Faustus.
That's what he was. That's what he was, and that's what he's always been. there he was, the whole show was deep in black magic. But as a magician, all his shows have a quality of magic, and of course the Men from Mars had a certain kind of hideous magic. And everything he does, he is a magician. That's his thing. And if the magic doesn't work, sometimes his shows are desperately in trouble. But if the magic works, it's wonderful.
You say also in relation to Dr. Faustus that Orson Welles, like Faustus, was rarely free of a sense of sin.
That's true. That's true. I don't know how it is now, but certainly in those days he felt that he was damned and pursued by furies, and that certainly made him play that part with a very vivid...
And this is a man still under 20 years of age, isn't
That's
he?
right. No, he was just about 20.
Just about 20. And that, of course, as you say, was a great success.
That's right. Then we got thrown off the Federal Theater for doing The Cradle Will Rock.
Got thrown off why?
Well, that's a long story. The federal government did not want us to do it at that time, and we took a high and mighty stand that we'd prepare the show and we were going to open it, and we opened it in a rather famous occasion when the whole audience walked something like 18 blocks from 39th Street up to into the East 50s, and we performed the play just
because you couldn't get in the theater where it was originally performed.
Because the Cossacks had moved in and shut us out.
Why was this play offensive?
Because it was all about a steel strike, and there was a big strike going on at Little Steel, and the WPA was coming up for its appropriation renewal, and they didn't want any nonsense with Congress. They were doing plays inciting strikers to strike.
It could play safely today, then, I suppose.
I think today yes, it would, and also it wouldn't be sponsored by the federal government today. But I don't know, it depends. It depends on the climate. Anyhow, we got thrown off, and then we formed our own theater, which was the Mercury Theater, which really...
What brought you to form your own theater, you and Orson Welles?
Because we just wanted to present plays. We were crazy. We just wanted to do the thing we'd been doing. Also, because of the experience we'd gained on the Federal Theater, we knew pretty much what our audience was, and we knew pretty much the kind of productions we wanted to do for them. And for the first year, of course, it worked. We had 5 smash hits in a row. Nothing could go wrong. By the second year, complications had set in. We were doing a radio show. We were too prosperous. Orson had too much publicity, and they were kind of laying for us. And anyway, I guess we didn't do as good shows. So the second year, we blew up, and the theater came to an end, and we went off to California to enter the movies, which we did.
What was the audience for the Mercury Theater?
Very left-wing, lower middle class, theater parties, not in the present kind of theater party with expensive tickets, but organizations, mostly left-wing organizations, buying in groups and making just the 50 cents a seat or $1 a seat that they could make by reselling it. And they were
Why
glad.
did you choose that group as your audience?
That was it. That was the WPA audience.
I see.
That was it, and a very large audience, and a very good audience it was. Very enthusiastic audience, quite an enlightened audience, and it was an ideal audience for us.
What could have kept the Mercury Theater going?
Less success and little more application to business, but by the time we had divided our attention between doing an hour radio show every week and running a theater and considering movie offers, and
Just split too many ways.
Just split too many ways.
And of course, it was the Mercury Theater of the Air, originally the Mercury Theater of the Air, in which the famous War of the Worlds
That's right.
played. How did that happen?
An accident again. We just wanted to do a science fiction show, and that was the show we picked on, and it turned out to be rather boring. So we brought it up to date and tried to freshen it up with as many topical, relevant allusions as we could. And as a result of that, we caused a national panic.
What was your role in that?
Well, I was actually the editor of the entire series, and I was also Orson's associate on the whole Mercury enterprise.
And he directed them,
yes, and produced them, really.
What happened after the broadcast of that? We all know what happened in the front pages of the newspapers. Panic broke out in parts of the country.
I mean, the panics you know about. We were locked in a back room at CBS, and the reporters came in and...
You mean you were literally locked in the room?
Oh, yes, for a long time. And the reporters came in, and they were very anxious to find out what had happened and what CBS knew about it and what we knew about it. So they would say things like, well, you know, you've heard about the 4 people who were killed on a highway in New Jersey. What other deaths have you heard about? And
none of this was true.
none of this was actually true. There were few accidents, and there were panics. Certainly, people rushed into the streets and rushed into churches and all kinds of things. But in fact, when all the hoopla had died down, there were actually, as far as we know, and certainly it would have been reflected in lawsuits, there were no fatalities. One lady broke her arm running out of her apartment.
You've done a great deal of radio and television since that time. Do you think there was any positive result out of that experience?
No, there were certain restrictions put on broadcasting by the FCC as a result of that.
Probably a positive result.
And probably quite rightly.
Simulating news broadcasts, I suppose.
That's
came
right.
out of that.
Essentially, that was the main ruling that went in. But it's a very, it's been commercially released on a record, and it's a very good show to this day.
What made it a good show?
Just it's very well constructed, very exciting, and as a radio show, one listens to it. One doesn't rush to the windows and see if the fog is coming over the Palisades, but one does, I think, stay with it very tightly. It's, I describe it in the book. It's a very careful and rather elaborate process of acceleration that makes it work that well.
Drama.
Yes.
Your relationship with Orson Welles pretty much broke up
That's
about this point, and he went to Hollywood.
Well, we all went to Hollywood. No, our relationship ended during the time we were in Hollywood. Then I came back and worked with Herman Mankiewicz on the first script of Citizen Kane, and then after that I left him for good.
You say,
although we did later, that's not quite true, a year later we did produce and he directed Richard Wright's Native Son. That was actually the last thing we did together.
You say in the book that some of the character of Welles himself comes through in the character of Kane.
Undoubtedly.
What part?
Well, some of the behavior, some of the rages, some of the whimsies. You know, it's a composite.
And some of the parts that made that picture the great picture it is.
I think so. Both Herman Mankiewicz and I knew Orson quite well, and we were amused and intrigued and bedazzled by certain of his characteristics. The actual facts, of course, are pretty close to the Hearst story, although even there's a bit of Pulitzer thrown in, a bit of other newspaper tycoons.
You and Mankiewicz and Welles had no concern about the ethics of making the story primarily about one man, but throwing in episodes out of the lives of other people.
None whatever.
That's quite legitimate in drama.
Absolutely. Of course it is. Shakespeare did much worse.
What of the films you did after that? This got you well launched in the film business. Which ones
Well, I made
do you think back upon?
about 23 films. The better known ones, the ones that are still on the air all the time, are The Bad and the Beautiful, which I'm very fond of, Executive Suite, Julius Caesar, Lust for Life. I have a couple of personal favorites. There's one called They Live by Night, which was Nick Ray's first picture. There's another one that I made much later at Metro called All Fall Down. John Frankenheimer directed, that I like very much.
Why are these your favorites? What sets them apart from the
one
others?
always likes one's frail children in a way that one doesn't like the successful ones, not quite the same way. But I had a lot of fun making pictures, and you know, I've enjoyed even, I made a documentary picture of the United States government right after I left the OWI called Tuesday in November. Which
and you did spend the 4 years with the OWI, as a matter of
Yes,
fact.
I went with the OWI in January '42, and we, about 5, 6, 7 of us really created the Voice of America. There were no broadcasts of the Voice of America at all when we got there, and within about 7 months there were about 800 a day, and building up that organization was very interesting and a great deal of fun.
Then you made this documentary, you say.
Then after I left and went back to Hollywood, they needed a documentary about the electoral system. They wanted to explain to the world what our government was, how it was constructed, and how the elections took place. And we made a picture called Tuesday in November, which was translated into about 26 languages and was enormously viewed all over the world.
Then, in addition to these movies, we mustn't slight the fact that you spent quite a bit of time in television, and of course returned to the stage as well with Lute Song, and then to the Stratford Festival with Shakespeare.
Yes, well, the time is a little mixed up, but in fact, I went to Stratford in '56, and I ran the American Shakespeare Festival. I was artistic director there for 4 years. And then at the same time, while I was doing that, I was doing TV. I was doing a tremendously unsuccessful but perfectly wonderful show called Seven Lively Arts.
Yes.
And then I became one of the 3 producers of Playhouse 90 for 2 years, all 3 of which won Emmys, and we really had a very good time. Then I went back into movies for a few years. Then I went abroad to write this book, and when I came back, I was asked if I would head the drama division of the Juilliard School, which was a brand new outgrowth of the famous Juilliard School of Music. And we did start that 6 years ago. Michel Saint-Denis came over and was my associate director on that. We formed the school, and out of that school came a rather miraculous growth, which is now called the City Center Acting Company, which is now probably the only permanent repertory company touring all over the continent and doing classics and modern masterpieces. And actually,
This was a hope you had many years ago, was it not, with the Mercury Theater?
well, I started, it's the 8th one I started.
Is that right?
Started the Mercury. I started one in California, which is now the very successful Center Company, which Gordon Davison heads at the Mark Taper Theater. I started one in California before the time was ripe, and that we did some nice things. We did the world premiere of Brecht's Galileo, but it was a financial disaster, and we had to close after a year. But I don't get discouraged. I certainly never expected to start this one, but here it is and doing very nicely. Its members will have worked 49 weeks out of 52 this year.
Did you ever expect to go into acting at the age of
No.
71?
That I never did.
What brought that about?
I was invited. I was asked, and
And couldn't resist the
I
temptation?
can never say no to anything. And well, this was a very attractive part, and it sounded like a very interesting movie. I read the script, and an old friend of mine was directing it, a young man of whom I had the prescience 13 years ago to engage at the munificent salary of $22.50 a week to be a second assistant stage manager of my company in Los Angeles, and so he repaid me 13 years later by offering me this part.
It's a wonderful part. We're going to take a look at just a brief excerpt from it. You, in the role, are a professor at the Harvard Law School.
I'm the dean of the Harvard Law School.
Dean of the
in
Harvard
fact,
Law
yes.
School.
The study of law is something new and unfamiliar to most of you, unlike any schooling you've ever been through before. We use the Socratic method here. I call on you, ask you a question, and you answer it. Why don't I just give you a lecture? Because through my questions, you learn to teach yourselves. Through this method of questioning, answering, we seek to develop in you the ability to analyze that vast complex of facts that constitute the relationships of members within a given society. In my classroom, there is always another question to follow your answer. Yes, you're on a treadmill. My little questions spin the tumblers of your mind. You're on an operating table. My little questions are the fingers probing your brain. We do brain surgery here. You teach yourselves the law, but I train your mind. You come in here with a skull full of mush, and you leave thinking like a lawyer.
I must confess, having seen that film just a couple of days ago, that I found myself intimidated sitting before you. That's how effective.
But now you've got over that, haven't you?
Yes, somewhat. However, still in admiration. How did it feel, having directed for so many years, to be on the other end of the process?
As far as I'm concerned, it was an unmitigated joy. I had a ball from beginning to end. There was a great advantage in knowing the director well, and in having a chance to discuss the thing with him beforehand. But after that, he left me pretty much alone. The film is brilliantly photographed. The cameraman is a great cameraman. He's the man who did Godfather. And a great deal of the impact of the role comes, as a matter of fact, from the way it was photographed. Because all through the beginning, I'm photographing these huge close-ups, and the poor children whom I'm tormenting are all in rather long shots and appear rather small, so that the impressiveness and the frighteningness is partly induced by the camera.
And very skillfully, I might
Very
add.
skillfully.
You do some teaching at Juilliard now.
Yeah, I do some. I don't do a great deal. I direct a play occasionally, and I address them on formal occasions and raise hell when they cut classes and that sort of thing.
But do you, in any resemblance to the role you play
No.
here, do you exert that kind of discipline upon your, or exact that kind of discipline from your students?
No, because we're in a very different profession. There's no point in howling at acting students, because that's not what you're there to do. You're there, in fact, to relax them and to let them find themselves. Whereas in a law school, presumably you're there to pound a certain amount of knowledge and certain thinking processes into their brains.
Has it changed your life at all now that you're recognized? That is
No.
to say, you've been recognized, but not recognized, I suspect, for your facial features as you are now.
No, it's
Not-
I kind of enjoy it at this moment, but it's not overwhelming. I'm not stampeded by enthusiastic crowds or anything of that kind. An occasional person looks at me and then turns back and says, "Hey, weren't you in Paper Chase?" Also, it hasn't had a general release yet. Anyhow,
see.
it's only just been shown in certain restricted runs.
One of the words that crops up in your book fairly frequently, I think, is the word temptation, and you used it in relation to Paper Chase. You were tempted to take that role. Has temptation played a rather important part in the decisions you've made?
Oh yes, very much.
Do you
As I-
wait for temptation to cross your path?
Yes, indeed. I invite temptation,
I see.
and I set up temptation. But nothing gives me greater pleasure than to be tempted. And as I say, I'm really quite incapable of ever saying no. So I succumb to temptation over and over and over again.
And you've also made much of the fact that discipline, despite what you've just said about the Paper Chase, has played a particular part in your own life. Growing out of a teacher you had at an early age who taught you the joys of discipline. I don't know if that's the precise phrase that you used.
Yes, no,
or
that's
not.
true. There is that in my nature, as was shown on the Argentine Pampa, which would very easily drift towards inertia as a way out of problems. And I think what I learned from that teacher and a couple of other teachers, because the English public school system, for me, was a very good training. It isn't for everyone. For me, it was good. The fact that it was really more pleasurable to act under discipline, as long as the discipline led to something you were interested in, than it was to lollygag around resisting and being idle. So that today it's almost absurd. I simply haven't had a holiday in 10 years, and I rather doubt if I shall ever have one, simply because I've got myself now into a pattern of work which is so persistent and so overwhelming that I really don't think I could ever reverse it, even for a short time.
Would you want to?
No, because I really fear what would happen if I did. As long as my energy and my health holds out, I see no particular point in submitting to that temptation. That's a temptation that doesn't attract.
Do you miss anything from this life? The leisure of having the time to do the trivial things?
I suppose, yes. I can see that I've missed all kinds of things. But you can't have everything in life. And I make enough time to do some very bad gardening and a great deal of travel, which I try and combine with my work. I'm not sorry for myself. I'm not complaining about my hard work. In fact, I'm rather boasting about it.
You said in the book that at the age of 18, going back some years now, that you wrote in the book that Mother had achieved her goal at 18, that is when you were 18. Her son was tall, blue-eyed, and multilingual, with a pleasant manner and a completed British public school education. You've made reference to all of these. Since then, of course, you've built a notable career in the theater and in film, and as an actor, you've sampled virtually all the rewards that your profession has to offer. Have you ever wondered how your mother, was she still alive, or is she still alive?
She is still alive.
She is still alive.
She is 93 and a half.
How does your mother view her son today?
Oh, I think she's perfectly satisfied. I don't think she realizes exactly what these various activities of mine have been, because we've always lived very far apart. She's lived in Paris all her life. And she's seen the clippings, and I've written to her, but I think she's perfectly pleased.
How do you feel about the future of the Broadway theater?
I am not at all pessimistic. About the theater in general, I am very sanguine indeed. I'm very optimistic. What's happened in the last 10 years all over this country is again one of those theatrical miracles. Out of this wasteland has sprung a whole series, probably 4 or 5 dozen, perfectly viable, good, interesting, energetic, and valuable theatrical organizations. And that with them have come new audiences, and all over the country, live theater is enjoying a sort of minor boom, and in some cases even a major boom, such as it hasn't known since the 30s. New York City is a different problem, but that's partly a real estate problem, partly a sociological problem, partly the fact that the commercial theater has not really adjusted to the new necessities and requirements of theater. I think it was probably so, the system was so extensive and so hardened that it probably was difficult. But I think it's happening now. Institutional theaters are beginning to take over in New York City, and I believe we shall have, as they do in London today, half the theater made up of institutional, subsidized, public service theaters, so to speak, and then beside them will be the commercial theaters, no longer under the necessity of filling all these theaters, which they aren't at the present moment able to fill with worthwhile things, but functioning perfectly happily, successfully, probably subsidized also in part by the mass media and the record companies and so on. And I think also having adjusted to a new, younger audience, having found ways to let people come to the theater at prices they can afford to come in, I think 5 or 6 years from now we shall not be talking any longer about a Broadway crisis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Houseman.
Thank you.